It's 10:33, so why don't we get started? Again, my name is Ana Lucia Cordova. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Office of Research. And my team hosts the Team Research Forum a few times a year to bring information about new opportunities for research, new activity on campus, and we also try to find ways to help you in building up your strategy around funding your research program. So today we are very happy to welcome our colleagues from the CONAFE group, who will talk to us a little bit about how to engage with the Department of Defense, in particularly around life sciences and biomedical sciences and research. Our speaker today is going to be Dr. Eric Wolf, who has over 20 years experience in medical research and development. And with the CONAFE group, he assists with federal R&D programs and partnerships with government and academia. What we're going to do today is Eric is going to go over his presentation, and we are inviting you to start posting your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them as we go during the presentation. And with that, I'm going to let Eric take over and talk to us about how to engage with the Department of Defense.
Thank you so much, Ana Lucia. Appreciate the invitation to present. My name is Eric Wolf. I'm a vice president at the CONAFE Group. The CONAFE Group is a small federal relations firm that is working with DC-based, that's working with UC Davis to help faculty really grow, diversify, expand their research portfolios. And if you when you originally registered for this presentation, it was probably called DoD 101. I changed the title a little bit, and you'll see why on the first slide or the second slide. Just based on some of the things that are happening here in DC and the importance of growing and diversifying your research portfolio. The presentation will still focus on sort of understanding the Department of Defense medical research enterprise and how you can leverage that. I spent about 15 years with the Department of Defense. First half was as a researcher at Walter Reed Hospital, and the second half was as a program manager within the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command. And a lot of that will become more apparent on the sort of differences in pipelines for the DoD as I go through. So without further ado, there we go. Okay, so really this particular presentation is going to cover the need to diversify. It's probably fairly apparent at this moment. What is DoD medical research? And then really starting to dive into some of the different programs within the DoD medical research enterprise, specifically the Defense Health Agency, their core program, their congressionally directed programs, and then some of the nuances associated with submitting proposals to the Department of Defense. So the need to diversify, I think, is pretty, as I mentioned, apparent at this moment. There's a lot going on here in DC. So much is unknown, and really, it's so important to think about where there may be other opportunities to find research funding for faculty, for industry, for nonprofits, for everyone. So, really critical to think now about how you can continue your lines of research within the NIH, which I think will be there, but also start thinking about other opportunities to look for research funding and support funding in other places. Just a brief update, the current government is funded through March 14th, and there's a lot going on right now with moving pieces, but just wanted to sort of bring this up to let everyone know that as part of our relationship with UC Davis, we're keeping an eye on this. We're relaying this information to leadership. And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to let us know. So I'm going to sort of dive into the meat of this now. The Department of Defense really traditionally commits about $3 billion annually to military medical research. And that's managed primarily through the Department of the Defense Health Agency, which directs reports directly to the Secretary of Defense. More than half of this funding is executed by the congressionally directed research programs, and their mission statement is listed there. And I'll talk about some of the differences and where the other half of the money is directed. But really, the CDMRP, one of the nuances is that it's funded annually through the Appropriations Act. So all the things I'm going to talk about today are sort of on hold until a budget is passed. So now is a good time to start planning. It's not the best time to sort of throw your hands up in the air and be frustrated, although that's perfectly allowed as well. But it's a great time to start thinking and planning about when these funds are released, hopefully within a few weeks, to start looking for opportunities to apply and places where your research will fit well within their priorities. So the Department of Defense specifically engages in medical research when they are looking for a couple specific things. One is solutions specifically needed to address warfighter health. And you can see some of the examples here. The other is solutions that are needed within the military health system of care, which is also owned by the Defense Health Agency. And then thirdly, when directed by Congress. And this sort of goes, and I'll talk more about this in future slides, to the congressionally directed medical research programs, which are directly directed by Congress. But there are other ways that they can direct appropriations or direct military medical defense through report language and through instructing the department that it needs to invest in certain areas, and then it becomes the department's responsibility to use existing funds to try to fund that type of research. One thing that I want to point out pretty aggressively at the beginning is that almost all military medical research is focused on generating solutions. And what I did here was I pulled a couple of key statements from these different uh, uh, commands and agencies within the Department of Defense that execute medical research funding, and highlighted some of the areas that really align to these goals of generating solutions for warfighters and for the American population at large. So you can see under the DHA, there's the discovery of innovative medical solutions. The U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command is a medical material developer, which basically means that they're looking for, product knowledge products and material products that are going to contribute to filling priority gaps that both the Army and the Joint Services need. And then you can see the same here within the Navy, Naval Medical Research Command, looking to uh, look for solutions to optimize health, readiness, and performance. So I always include this slide in my DoD presentations because one, this is a very complicated process. This simplifies it a little bit, but it's a traditionally fairly complicated process, and this is a complicated slide on purpose because of that. But it does help outline sort of the trail of money and how it comes from Congress down to some of these agencies and some of the program announcements that you might see when you're looking to apply for some of these things. So typically the money travels down through the Secretary of Defense to the Defense Health Agency and then is divided up into these core funding efforts and congressionally directed efforts. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the military health system, which is a humongous bill that is due every year. It's about a $50 billion a year enterprise. So there's a lot of funds that go just toward providing care for service members, their beneficiaries, and retirees. And then in the top left-hand corner, you can see there are other sources of funding within the Department of Defense. So services respectively get their own lines of funding, not as much as they used to. These before the development of the Defense Health Agency, which is only 11 years old, all of the money was executed individually to the services. But you can also see programs like DARPA and DTRA, which is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency focused on, biological and chemical defense, Special Operations Command, and others as well. So I'm going to focus most of this talk on defense health because that's where the bulk of the money goes, and that will follow. There's a question real quick about distinguishing DoD funding from VA funding. VA has its own directional line of funding that is part of the Veterans Health Administration. The VA funding is very unique in the sense that it is executed almost exclusively intramurally. And this means that VA funding has to be applied for and supporting VA researchers within the VA health system. And this could be researchers, clinician researchers, and other support staff that are looking for medical research funding. There are ways to collaborate with VA medical centers to allow extramural researchers to conduct VA research, but traditionally it's an intramural program. And then finally, what I'll say is that DoD also has intramural laboratories, which you can partner with, but the majority of their funding is executed extramurally. I'd say probably 70 to 80% of their funding is executed extramurally. Within DHA, you have this sort of Defense Health Research and Engineering Directorate, which is doing a lot of the work that is akin to what I would say, NIH structure. They have program directors, they have program managers, they have support staff, which are, leveraging the community and other places to generate priorities and then illustrate those priorities out to the community to bring in research applications. And I'll talk more about that later. I did want to talk just briefly about some historical references and how things have changed over the past just couple of years, because the Army was the primary funder of medical research up until about 2 years ago. And then there was congressional language which directed that all service-related medical R&D funds would flow and be executed under the Defense Health Agency. So some of the key changes are organizationally are the changes from these three core programs on the right-hand side of your slides to these sort of new 5 different what they're calling portfolios on the left-hand side. And really, these are valuable, and I'll talk about this in a minute, because these respective portfolios have published what are called strategic plans, and they really give good insight into what their priorities for each of these portfolios are. But really, the general goal is for them to treat and look for joint warfighter health solutions to all of these potential threats. I won't go through and list all of these, but you can see that the number of health and medical threats that are faced by warfighters in training and operational environments. And then besides that, on the actual performance optimization side, there's the idea that in order to be ready to deploy and to fight wherever and whenever needed, you need all these other additional components to make sure that the fighting force is ready to go as needed and at their optimal performance. And then finally, the Defense Health Agency, as I mentioned, is responsible for the military health system, which cares for, almost 10 million beneficiaries every year, or just in general. They're responsible for 54 military hospitals across the country and the world. And everything is encompassed under this TRICARE health plan, which means that everything isn't, there's no third-party payers. Everything is all encompassing to this military health system. So I sort of alluded to previously these research portfolios, and within them there are sub-portfolios, and each of them have program managers. And really their responsibility is to, within the confines of the needs of the mission, define how they want to outline their plan to, fund military medical research to solve the biggest problems possible and necessary within a given time frame, and usually that time frame is about 7 to 10 years. And they do that in a number of ways. So they leverage strategic documents, so you can see National Defense Strategy, the Defense Health Strategy specifically, service-specific medicine strategies. They leverage and have a lot of interaction with combatant commanders across the world. Certainly the requirements of a commander in Africa are going to be different than the priorities in Europe, which are going to be different than, the Pacific Ocean. So there's significant differences across these commander needs. And it's important to understand all of them to make sure that the priorities are listed. Um, they look at service requirements, they look at end user interactions, clinical practice guidelines, and they also attend professional conferences. So they are professionals on their own, and they are really trying to understand the state of the science. So there's opportunity to interact with them occasionally at uh, professional conferences. There's a question real quick. So we may have heard that HHS and NIH are shifting some of their priorities from infectious disease to chronic disease. Do you expect the same for DoD? So this is a great question. You're 100% right. There is likely going to be a strategic shift at NIH and within HHS away from infectious disease and to chronic diseases. I don't know exactly how that's going to affect DoD. The limitation is that I think the DoD will still invest in infectious diseases. The limitation is that DoD is specifically concerned with infectious diseases that are extremely relevant to places where they're being deployed. So they're very interested in diarrheal diseases. They're interested in dengue. They're interested in um, I won't go through the list because frankly I don't know all of it, but there are key pathogens and key items that they are focused on. So while I believe there will still be infectious disease research funding within the Department of Defense, it's going to be somewhat restricted and somewhat narrowly focused to be able to address the priorities that they have. So moving on with regard to sort of how program managers think within the Department of Defense, and this will be important later on as we talk about the culture and how to apply against these funding opportunities. Program managers take all of these inputs that they have. They work with a programmatic panel of experts, similar to how at NIH they have advisory committees for each of the institutes and some of the centers. And then from that, they build out the prioritization. POM planning is basically thinking about 7 to 10 years into the future, as I mentioned, and trying to strategize of what funding will be needed in which years to try to achieve solutions. They look at portfolio balance, and they also have good relationships and conversations with other agencies to understand what they're funding. And then through all of that, they develop a strategic research plan that looks a little bit like this. I know this is a little bit busy, but all of this information is available through these links. And really their goal is to identify the high level priorities and start to drill down into what specific solutions or opportunities can they look for from innovators like yourselves to try to address some of these priorities. And then the reason I show this slide is because, again, this is sort of how DoD program managers tend to think. And this can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but I think the biggest takeaway is that they're thinking significantly into the future. Their main goal is to develop solutions that sort of address the end goal that's listed on the left-hand side of the slide here. And they're milestone driven, so they're looking for milestones along the way. And they're also looking to understand how they can leverage other pots of funding to help meet the goals within their sort of constrained resources. So now I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about the congressionally directed programs. It's important to know that everything I've spoken about until now has been really with regard to the defense, health, S&T programs. It's also important to know that it's very difficult. They don't necessarily provide transparency on how much money each of their portfolios have. They're starting to provide more transparency with what their priorities are. The other thing that's important is that on the defense health S&T side, those program managers are very willing to have conversations with external performers. Whereas on the congressionally directed side, they will not interact with external performers. And the reason for this is because the congressionally directed programs are directed specifically by congressional intent. And in order to make everything fair across the country for anyone who wants to apply, they've made a sort of a decision that they are going to not speak with any performers just in lieu of fairness. So that's just sort of one of the ways things works. But these are not mutually exclusive. So the CDMRP programs are often informed by some of the defense health programs. The program managers that I alluded to previously participate in the advisory boards of these programs. And another thing I mentioned previously is that these defense health S&T portfolio managers really rely on this congressional funding to meet some of their priorities and needs. So they're looking at these programs closely. They are well aware of them, and they may sometimes, if you're having a conversation with them, direct you to certain programs where you could apply to help them meet the needs of their program. But now, specifically transitioning to CDMRP, they are an execution management agency. One of the key things is that they plan in the year of execution. So I mentioned that on the defense health S&T side, they plan 7 to 10 years into the future. CDMRP only plans 1 year at a time. So this is really important, especially now, because they can't release new programs until a budget is passed. So there, as we talk through, and I would encourage you to visit the CDMRP website, you'll see a lot of pre-announcements there for programs that they're hoping to release, but they can't release anything under a continuing resolution. So they're allowing investigators to sort of prepare and get ready, but nothing released at the moment. Then I think I've covered everything here. So the CDMRP has 35 congressionally directed programs, or at least they had 35 in the previous fiscal year. That could change. That changes from year to year on where Congress decides to appropriate funding. And I've sort of, they don't do this, but I've sort of divided them into sort of two different buckets. One are the military specific programs, and the other are the national programs. The military specific, for example, include things like combat readiness, the military burn program, orthopedics, and then the national programs include a large number of neurodegenerative or neural disease type of research programs, a lot of cancer programs, and other spinal cord injury and other things. So there are really significant opportunities within these congressional programs to apply your research toward. Here's a full list here on this slide, and you can see it ranges all over the place. I believe there's um, almost $500 million available just in cancer research alone. So a good amount of dollars here that are available on a yearly basis to look for funding opportunities. Um, I, th As I mentioned previously, while the CDMRP has really taken a stance of not speaking directly with individual program managers to sort of level the playing field and to make sure that they are fully transparent, they have a really exceptional website where they have a tremendous amount of information available. And this not only includes information about each program that they provide, but also within those programs, they have the makeups of their respective panels, both peer review panels and programmatic panels. They have previous and recent applications that were recommended for funding. They have their priorities listed. So there's really a tremendous amount of information you can gain from this website. I'll go a little more. You can look at the archives to look at the language from previous year funding opportunities to get an idea of what they're asking for. And they also have webinars that provide a lot of information um, on how to interact or how to apply toward the CDMRP. So what they lack in sort of direct communication with faculty, they make up for in providing a significant amount of information that can help you as a researcher dive into the program and understand not just at face value what they're looking for, but who's going to be reviewing your proposals. What specific focus areas are they going to be looking for? What have they funded in the past, and other things like that. So for the most part, CDMRP operates in the space of up to and including phase 1 clinical trials. Sometimes they have awards that range into phase 2 clinical trials. But the predominance of their awards, and some of these are redundant, they have a lot of different programs and a lot of different program managers. So they don't always have consistency with their naming conventions, but for the most part, they operate in the sort of discovery up to and including the preclinical space, and then sometimes into the clinical space. And just sort of to reiterate a couple of nuances is um, all the cycles are annual. The government has 2 years to obligate the funds. So basically what this means is the federal government moves slowly. So even if you apply for an opportunity today, you probably wouldn't get a notice of funding till probably 9 to 12 months from now. And then there's another portion of negotiation process to work out the final details to actually release the funding. And then on the S&T program side, they execute funding in a couple of different ways. They do have a broad agency announcement. Sometimes the CDM they can sometimes leverage the CDMRP to execute funding on their behalf. They use other transaction authorities like MTech, and some of these are available on grants.gov or sam.gov, and we look at these closely and can relay those to you. So I want to sort of go through now the idea of submitting a proposal against any of these programs, what some of the unique um, differences are, and then where there are some similarities between this and maybe submitting a traditional NIH or NSF program. So I've mentioned this a few times now, but it's worth repeating that the DoD medical research funding is specifically focused on developing solutions. But I think the important part is that especially for a lot of these CDMRP programs, it's not necessarily only solutions for warfighters, but could also include and does also include, typically in their language, health system beneficiaries, veterans, and civilians. So this is important to understand, especially when you're submitting to these national programs that they should be relevant to warfighters, they should be and relevant to veterans and civilians as well. You really want to understand the clinical implications of your research. And what I mean by this is even because everything is so solution focused, even if you are proposing mechanistic or foundational research, you really need to think as uh, um, maybe a researcher, or maybe a clinician, or maybe both, how your findings are potentially going to extrapolate to solutions for warfighters. And that means changes to the standard of care, novel technologies that could be employed for diagnosis or treatment or prevention. So even though you are looking at potentially foundational and idea-based research generation, you have to think a little bit forward into how that might affect the population that you are thinking about. You really want to tell the whole story. It's very valuable and important to leverage existing or prior research from the Department of Defense or other agencies to really not speak about only the microcosm of the project that you're submitting, but your larger vision for again how you're going to move toward developing a clinical solution. And I should caveat here that developing a clinical solution could mean licensing out to a company. It could mean spinning out a company. It could mean just publishing and getting high impact solutions into clinical practice guidelines. So there's a lot of pathways for getting to solutions, but it's important to think about. And then you want to relay the impact of your research, not only on the battlefield, but as I mentioned, within the military health system and in other health systems, and then associated with long-term health and wellness of warfighters, veterans, and civilians. So good question. So does the DoD fund research on military animals? The answer is yes. They're actually within the graphic that I showed previously about the Defense Health Agency portfolios. There's a portfolio that is dedicated specifically to military working dogs. And they have specific priorities that are listed toward that. Really, the bulk of that funding is somewhat sporadic. If you're interested in proposing research specifically toward DoD working animals and military working animals, then it would be valuable for us to have a conversation about that and maybe target specific program managers that we can have a conversation with about where the opportunities might lie. As far as I know, there are no congressionally directed programs that are focused on military service animals. So now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about some of the once you sit down to write a proposal, the proposal similarities versus some of the differences specific to the DoD application. So the project narrative, I would say, is fairly similar to what you're going to provide in an NIH application. Obviously, you want to describe the innovation of your idea, the specific aims, preliminary data. In some cases, there are some programs that actually prohibit preliminary data. There are some that require significant preliminary data and everything in between. And then your research methodology, along with statistical analyses and things like that. Supporting documents, facilities documents, biosketches, supports, letters of support and collaboration. And then there are also technical and lay abstracts that are part of the submission. The difference is one is just in format, and that the DoD sort of breaks its submission into all these individual sections. So everything that I listed previously and everything that I'm listing here are sort of relayed within their own section. So there's an occasion, and there's potential to be redundant in some cases, and sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's a matter of focusing and trying to figure out which portion of your writing goes into which of these sections, but that's another thing we can help with. But in general, some of the things to think about with regard to DoD proposals, relevance to military health. And again, as I mentioned previously, that doesn't always just mean service members who are in operational settings. It could mean training settings. It could mean hospital-based settings. It could mean, their beneficiaries or retirees. So, there are things like Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury and autism, which are all relevant to the military health system in the sense that maybe it's not directly, or sometimes it's directly related to the service member themselves, or sometimes it's related to their children, their spouses, or if they've gotten out and still have the ability to seek care as a retiree, then that's their prerogative. Um, Impact statement is really important. Transition plan is something that I mentioned a lot in terms of describing how eventually your research will lead toward a solution. Statement of work is something that is usually fairly foreign to academic performers, in the sense that you have to provide sort of a detailed description of a task by task, on a task by task basis of what you're going to do with milestones of what you're going to achieve and when. There's a DoD data management plan, and then there's also a detailed budget and budget justification that is required, which is um, for some NIH applications that's there, but for most it's not. The other important thing to note about DoD applications is that every proposal is a two-tier review um, program. The first is fairly traditional. So all submitted proposals, full proposals, go through a peer review process, which are similar to study sections. They have study leaders, they have individual researchers who are going to review your proposal, usually two or three, and then they come together, discuss the proposals, and provide a written critique and a scientific score that's based on the merit as they decide it. One of the nuances is there's no standing peer review panel. So because CDMRP operates sort of on a year-to-year basis, peer review panels are new every year, and there's no contact between the reviewers and applicants. The other interesting point for both the peer review panel and the programmatic panel as I transition is both of them include what are called consumer reviewers. And these are typically non-scientists that are dealing with whatever the indication that you're applying to itself, or they're a care provider of someone who's dealing with that indication. But really, it's someone who's been affected by the illness or injury that you're applying against, and makes recommendations based on their lived experience. Um, and then on the programmatic review, what happens is those programmatic reviewers are responsible for evaluating all of the scientifically reviewed proposals against the program. In this case, the program announcement, to make decisions on your alignment to that program announcement, portfolio balance. So if they funded something very similar in the past year or two, they may elect to not fund a highly scored research study, and other decisions. So um, this is really interesting because they don't sort of rack and stack the scientific proposals, scientifically scored proposals in the order of score, and then just create a pay line. This programmatic panel has the ability to review each one at a time and move them around based on their impact and alignment to the program. And this is sometimes the more difficult part, is not only writing your proposal to the peer reviewers, but also to the programmatic reviewers. There's a question is, how can we reach the program officers and how can we become a DoD program reviewer? So to become a DoD, becoming a DoD peer reviewer is more easy than becoming a programmatic reviewer. The programmatic reviewers are typically hand selected by the program manager, and they are often active duty or retirees that have significant expertise in those particular areas. For some of the cancer programs and neurodegenerative programs, they recruit programmatic reviewers from NIH, from VA, from CDC, from other organizations. Sometimes they recruit civilians. So it's possible, but typically they'll reach out to you. And then on the peer review side, you can absolutely volunteer to be a peer reviewer. And you can do that through the CDMRP website. There's just by sending an email to the generic email that's available, you can provide some of your information and your expertise and offer to be a peer reviewer. So really, the next step is sort of what happens next. So one thing that you can do in the DoD that you can't necessarily do in other agencies is submit multiple applications twice, or the same application twice. Um, so if there are multiple programs, so let's say there's a Defense Health Core program, S&T program, where you have a really good idea that's really well aligned to their program, then you can submit a proposal there. And then if there's a similar program in the congressionally directed programs, you can submit the same exact program there if you'd like. And you can't be funded twice for the same work, but you can, submit to multiple different spots. Similarly, some programs individually will allow for multiple applications from the same PI within different mechanisms within that program. So again, like let's say you have a later stage research idea within the autism program. You can submit that, and then if additionally, if they have a mechanism available for earlier stage research and you have an idea there, you can submit there as well. Only limitation there is you have to write two proposals, which is not easy. Next thing after you submit your proposal, if you submit a full proposal, you will receive a summary statement and a scientific score, which is a little different than NIH. You can submit a full proposal and not be discussed. So every full proposal that is submitted is discussed. So you'll receive a score and feedback, which is valuable. And then from there, you'll receive a notification, and that notification will be either funded, not funded, or an alternate. Typically, alternates are rarely funded, but if someone who is recommended for funding can't accept the money for whatever reason, either they got funded somewhere else or some other reason, then they'll start going down the alternate list and look for opportunities to fund them. DoD, as I mentioned, so now let's say you receive either an alternate and you're not funded, or a not recommended for funded letter, and now because each of these programs are on a yearly basis, there's certainly an opportunity to submit next year. So as I mentioned, DoD mechanisms and CDMRP specifically don't have dedicated study sections or the sections that are available to respond to reviewer comments. However, I find it very valuable to respond to reviewer comments regardless. And what you can do is you can use part of your narrative to address comments from your reviewers. And I think this accomplishes a couple different things. You could potentially get the same reviewers, and obviously they'll appreciate your listening to them. Even if you get different peer reviewers, I find that they still appreciate you taking peer review feedback and making your science better. And again, I wouldn't dedicate more than probably half a page. So it's going to be very different than an NIH response to reviewer comments. You're going to really pick out the priority ones. You're going to direct the readers to where you've made changes within the document. And you're going to do so in a really small amount of space. A couple questions here. So, how do groups like MTech interface with the peer and program review process? Although there are, also, are there specific IP terms associated with awards? Good questions. So MTech is unique. MTech exists through another transaction authority, which means that they execute research funding on behalf of the defense health S&T programs that are aligned to those priorities. Their peer and programmatic review processes are a little bit different. The program managers have a little bit more power to both leverage their peer reviewers. They're typically a much smaller peer review panel, and the programmatic decision making is a little bit different, and that does go into how you write the proposals. On the other side of that coin, a lot of these managers are available to have conversations with. So there's the ability to talk with them, really get an understanding of what their priorities are, and then structure your proposal against that to give you the best opportunity. With regard to IP, there's some nuanced and different rules, but I think the biggest thing I can say is that the Department of Defense doesn't want to own your IP. There are some cases in, high impact and potentially highly classified programs, typically in like chemical threat defense and national defense, where they may want some type of additional rights. But for the most part, the DoD doesn't want to own your IP. They want to provide support so that you can advance your IP to a product where they're going to be able to purchase whatever the product is, or leverage the product if it's, say, a knowledge product, to improve the care of warfighters and improve the care of their patient population. So, what I would recommend to get more information on IP rules is to look through the CDMRP website at a previous year's funding announcement, or some of the general instructions that are provided. And there's a lot of different language in there on data rights and what the government wants versus doesn't want. But for the most part, they want you to own the IP and develop it toward the ability of generating warfighter solutions. So the next question is, what are submission dates like? Different from each program, same across the DoD, hard cutoff line, rolling submissions. For the most part, let me address congressionally directed at first, and even some of the core defense health programs. There's usually a hard cutoff. Typically, from the time a program is released to the time of the final due date, there is roughly, I'd say, 3 to 5 months of time to write a full proposal, sometimes a little bit longer. A lot of the programs, all of the programs require a two-step process. Some require a letter of intent, which is basically a notification that you're going to submit a full proposal so that the program managers can decide how many peer reviewers they need. Other programs require a full pre-proposal, and by full, I mean usually 3 pages. And they make decisions and triage those pre-proposals and only invite a select number of full proposals. This typically happens in programs where they get a lot of response, but only have a limited amount of funding. So really the goal there is to not waste your time and not waste the reviewers' time in terms of maximizing the amount of reviews they can do for the amount of money they have. There are a couple of rolling submission programs. The Defense Health Agency has a broad agency announcement, and the Special Operations Command have broad agency announcements, both of which are open, I believe, for 3 to 5 years and allow rolling submissions. My recommendation, both as a former program manager and now in my current role, is to not submit against rolling submission programs unless you've had a conversation with a program manager and they've encouraged you to submit and they are expecting to see your pre-proposal come in, for a couple of reasons. One is because if they solicit you to respond and you do, it's possible that the pre-proposal could get routed to the wrong person. So you want to make them aware that you're going to be submitting. And then additionally, you don't want to waste your time submitting if they don't have funding for it or if it's not all well aligned with the priorities. So always worthwhile having a conversation with a program manager before submitting against rolling submission opportunities. Um, Okay, with respect to differences, could you please comment on DoD funding being contracts versus grants? For almost everything that I've talked about today, the DoD expresses these programs as grants, not contracts. Contracts are typically expressed by Department of Defense for significantly later stage research. And this is typically when they are trying to take products or other solutions that have been demonstrated as safe and efficacious and further develop them for military specific needs. And that could imply shelf life stability, packaging, indications, directions, how they're going to be fielded, size if they need to be fit within a medic's kit. So for the most part, as faculty, I would not worry about that very much. Um, Predominance of these are expressed as grants. They are quote unquote best effort grants, which means they expect you to be somewhat independent, but provide certainly quarterly and annual reports against the work that you're doing that aligns to the proposal that you had submitted, was reviewed, recommended for funding, and then funded. So the actual execution is more akin to NIH, I'd say, than to working within the DoD contract confines, and how you execute that. The one nuance that I'll maybe give is with regard to DARPA. DARPA operates significantly differently in the extent that not that they execute things as contracts, and sometimes they do, but their program managers operate more like contract officers in the sense that they have sometimes weekly meetings with PIs that really want to understand the progress you're making towards specific milestones and want to understand the work that you're doing on a very detailed level as they move through. But for the most part, everything I've spoken about today is going to be illustrated as grant. And actually, it's a good segue to some of the programs that I didn't talk about, but that other places where we can help. So there are other programs within the Department of Defense where you may find that your research fits, if I haven't mentioned it already. Defense Threat Reduction Agency is really focused on chemical and biological early science. And then the JPEO, CBRND, the next bullet down is really their partner on more of the advanced development side to fund later stage research, clinical trials, things like that. DARPA funds really high risk, really high reward programs. There's one that was just released focusing on basically smart wound care. It's called like bioelectronics for I don't remember. It's called BEST is the acronym. They love their acronyms, but using advanced technologies to understand and potentially provide treatment in real time for novel wounds. There's the Special Operations Command, Office of Naval Research, Air Force Laboratory. All of these have respective entry points, and there are ways to converse with them and talk to program managers. It's a little bit of a trepidatious time right now. There's still a lot of unknowns here in DC on communication. So we're staying apprised of these as much as we can, but For the most part, there's still a lot of things happening on a hour by hour basis sometimes. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about how we help individual faculty. So really, we, from a strategic standpoint, again, have partnered with UC Davis to help individual faculty, understand and brainstorm how they can diversify their opportunities. We can review drafts of your proposals and help build those proposals toward the various cultures of these different agencies. We can help build partnerships with intramural researchers or extramural researchers as well. Help you with understanding some of the nuances of what everything that we've discussed today, and help look for other opportunities. Um, and then I was going to say one other thing I forgot about. So this is my email address. I would say the best way to contact us, you can email me directly, but what I would recommend, and I don't see it, please feel free to jump in, is CCing um, Ana Lucia. I think they've created a specific email for us. There you go. Thank you very much. That basically this goes to their office, which will alert them that you guys have reached out and requested a meeting with us just for tracking purposes, and making sure that we are, um, covered, being responsible and for everyone's time. So, um, the other thing I would offer is, if you want to please reach out, feel free to reach out to us. But I would provide just a brief description of, who you are, what type of research you do, what maybe you're interested in. If you don't know what you're interested in terms of the DoD, if it exists, that's perfectly fine. Um, but really, the initial conversations that we try to have are really to try to meet each other, get an understanding of what's going to be going on, what you're interested in, and where we can start looking for opportunities. And I think that's all I have. I know we have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, please use your raise your hand function, and then we'll call on you, or post your question on the chat box and we can get to it. Can you be a little bit more specific about the dates?
Do you mean application dates? I don't quite understand your question. Yes. Okay. So I'll try my best. So I think the place to start is with CDMRP. So they can't release their programs until a congressional budget is passed. But let's say, for example, on March 14th, when the continuing resolution ends, that they figure out a way to pass the federal budget. What will end up happening is they will slowly start to release these programs over the next probably 3 to 4 months. And each of these programs will have their own specific dates, but those dates will be very specifically outlined from when pre-proposals are due, when full proposals are due, when they expect their peer review meetings to happen, when they expect their programmatic meeting reviews to happen, and when you expect to get a notification of funding. So really, each program is going to be different. We will do our best to notify you and give you as much of a heads up as possible. The other thing to do is to go to the CDMRP website. They have a great listserv where you can get information about specific programs. Thank you very much for that. You can pick all of the programs, you can pick individual programs, and they'll update you on when they release information. And then other than that, if you have any other specific questions, just please feel free to send me an email and we'll make sure we get those answered. My current impression is that this is more for applied and translational science than basic science. If my research is not clinically applicable, but is near use, but not near use directly in the clinic, is worth submitting. The answer is sometimes, of course. And it depends on there are multiple programs across the Department of Defense and the CDMRP that allow what are called they again have different names for them. They call them idea development or discovery awards or idea initiation awards. And really it's for um, ideas just like you're describing that are very foundational, probably even pre animal model, where you're just exploring an idea. The typically the range of value for those is somewhere in the 300 to $600,000 range. In terms of sometimes that's direct cost, sometimes that's total costs, but akin to I'd say an R21. There are opportunities available. I think the key is even if the research doesn't end up going the way you think it's going to, or goes in multiple different directions, which can happen with basic science, you have to sort of think about what the potential impact of that early stage science could be that's aligned to the program that you're submitting within. So there's some nuances to what I'm describing. I'd say in general, there are opportunities for basic scientists within the Department of Defense. It's just a matter of finding those, structuring your proposal the right way, and thinking a little bit forward about how your basic science may eventually transition to applied and translational science. And I know we're getting close to the end of time. Anyone have any additional questions?
Be one more question.
I mean, otherwise we're available. Um, uh, does work requiring MHS data require a sponsor inside the DoD? That's a good question. Sometimes it certainly helps. There are some DoD databases that are publicly available, but for the most part, I think you're right. There are a few places throughout the country that are housed within military laboratories that have very, very robust MHS and other types of, I'll say, military data. So expeditionary data, warfighter related injury data. There's a huge serum repository here in DC. So a few different opportunities to leverage available data for different types of retrospective or follow-on research.
Thank you. I think that's all of our time. Just a reminder, if you want to connect with our colleagues at the CONAFE group, you can reach out to Eric directly. You can reach out to our team at the Office of Research or email conafe@ucdavis.edu and we'll help you make the necessary connection. There's going to be a follow-up email for everyone who registered for the session and we'll give you access to the recording and to the slides. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a lovely weekend and we'll see you next time.